Our topic today are the state seed mixes in Minnesota, recipes for success. Welcome everyone, and welcome to our panelists. Next slide. Our first speaker today is going to be Dan Shaw with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. Dan is the Senior Ecologist and Vegetation Specialist with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, BWSR. His work focuses on conservation partnerships, restoration, stormwater projects, climate planning, pollinator habitat, and invasive species control. He has also taught design and restoration classes at the University of Minnesota for the past 20 years and has authored several publications on restoration and stormwater project planning. Thank you very much, Dan, for being here with us today. Our second speaker is Jessi Strinmoen, who is a manager at Shooting Star Native Seed in Spring Grove, Minnesota. In addition to human resources, marketing, advertising, and safety compliance responsibilities, Jessi manages native seed sales for contractors and installers, many government agencies, tribal agencies, CRP producers, and landowners. Jessi has been with Shooting Star Native Seeds for over 7 years. Thank you both, Dan and Jessi, for being with us here today and bringing your expertise to our webinar series. During today's webinar, I invite everyone to provide questions. If you have them throughout the presentations, we'll be fielding questions after both Dan and Jessi's presentations. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A box. You'll see in the bottom, I think, right side of your screen, at least on the right side of that bar, the Q&A. So be sure to put your questions under Q&A and not the chat. If you have other technical issues or questions for the moderators, you can put that into the chat. But if you have questions regarding the presentation that you want fielded at the end, please put that into the Q&A box. Moving on, after the presentation, a pop-up window will come up, and we encourage you to please fill out the short survey that we have provided there. This provides us with an opportunity to glean information on where practitioners, the folks listening today, have interest in seeing future webinars and what sort of topics they think are most important. So that's really valuable information for us to be tailoring webinar presentations in the future for where people see the need. So please be sure to go ahead and do that. The webinar series, this is the fourth in our fall series of improving restoration webinars. We did another 4 earlier this spring, and we're hoping to do more in the future. It is a collaboration between the University of Minnesota Extension's Ecological Restoration Training Collaborative, their Restoring Minnesota Ecological Restoration Certificate. Courses are available through the website link you see there. These are foundational courses in learning kind of the basics and some of the more nuts and bolts aspects of doing restoration work and sort of the foundational aspects of that work, and also, you know, how to address different habitat types. So please, if you're interested, check in on that, and that URL is on the page there, or just search for Ecological Restoration Training Certificate, University of Minnesota, and you will find that. Myself, I work with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, also on behalf of the Board of Water and Soil Resources, on the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. And our work, we collaborate with experts and get in the field and review work that's being done, identifying some of the challenges and what's going on in the field, and really try to learn from that where there are opportunities for making improvement. And that is some of the basis for this webinar series, where through this program, we have really seen the need and the opportunities for some strategic improvements, and some really just continuing to build the knowledge base of restoration work, especially in the state of Minnesota. You'll see our URL link there, and I encourage you to check that out and contact us if you're interested. Okay, moving on, I think we will move right into the presentations. Dan Shaw is our first speaker. And Dan, I invite you to go ahead and share your screen. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Wade. It's good to be with everybody today. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yep, looks good.
Okay,
Thank you,
great.
Dan.
Yep. Okay, so today I'll be talking about our state seed mixes, and I'll talk about goals of these mixes, the history of these mixes and other mixes in Minnesota, different project types that are covered by the mixes, some of the considerations that we think about as we develop and update state seed mixes, the current update that's underway, and then some of the related technical resources that we've been working on that go along with our seed mixes. So starting with goals, I think it's important to recognize that we have a lot of challenges in our landscape, that we're seeing impacts to biodiversity. We're seeing decreases in pollinator populations, decreases in bird populations. And that's part of the reason that we're so focused on this effort. We have around 100 stakeholders that are involved in the update of state seed mixes and some of the resources around them. And I think part of the reason is that there's such a recognition now that we really need to be proactive in trying to find solutions to many of these challenges. So one of our key goals is increasing biodiversity and ecosystem health across Minnesota, really trying to find ways to expand the use of native seed mixes across the state and find different ways to incorporate seed mixes into landscapes. Another goal is having a resource for federal, state, and local agency staff who are working on restoration projects for agencies, guiding mitigation projects, working on utility line projects. Typically, we need seed mixes that we can refer to for these types of projects. These different projects also act as models for a wide range of project types. We've been expanding into different pilot mixes, partly because we get a lot of requests for different types of specialty seed mixes, and it's helpful for us to have mixes on hand when we get those requests. We're also trying to meet the needs of emerging grant programs and environmental challenges through these seed mixes. And then one other goal is maximizing project benefits and success rates. Through this larger stakeholder group, we're able to use research and different information that we've been collecting out on project sites to use our collective expertise to update these mixes and make them as effective within landscapes as possible. Some of the history with mixes, I wanted to start with different types of mixes that are available in the state. So we have these state seed mixes that we've been developing over time. Private seed vendors have their own mixes, and there's a lot of really good mixes out there from private seed vendors. Custom designed mixes are being done around the state. Sometimes these are being done by individual organizations. There are some calculators that are in use for developing some of these custom design mixes within Minnesota. There's a few NRCS and Fish and Wildlife Service mixes out there, not too many. And then there's also wild harvested mixes within the state. And these are seed that's collected from remnant plant communities or conservation plantings and then used for other projects. With the use of native seed mixes in Minnesota, I don't think it's really well documented. We know that seed first started being used around the 50s and 60s with mixes. It's a topic where it'd be good for additional research to understand that better. We know that much of that seed was coming up from Kansas and Nebraska at that time. So there were really limited sources of seed around that time. And so we've really improved a lot with our native seed vendors that are available in Minnesota, providing seed for projects. The first state seed mixes were developed around 2004 by Robert Jacobson, who was primarily working with MnDOT and working on roadside mixes, but his mixes were used for wetlands and prairies and lots of other uses as well. So that was the first set of state seed mixes that were developed. The standard mixes, about 30 or so mixes, were updated in 2008 and 2009 in a partnership between Bowser, MnDOT, and DNR. And then we created some pilot seed mixes around 2016 for different uses. These are experimental mixes that we're developing. And then we started a new update of mixes in 2020. Some of the project types that are covered by state seed mixes are prairie reconstruction projects. These could be for roadsides or for like mitigation, prairie projects, stormwater projects, wetland mitigation, woodland restoration. There's a few woodland mixes, utility line projects, roadsides, agricultural and urban BMPs, and more specialized uses with the pilot seed mixes that have been under development. This is a list of some of the main considerations that we think about when we're working on these mixes, using current research and field data, project goals, reference plant community composition. So we're looking at some relevant data and information from different reference plant communities, cultural considerations, wildlife needs, such as having floral resources through the seasons for pollinators, species availability, definitely factors in, and that's where vendors are helpful in letting us know what is available for mixes, the resiliency of mixes, cost, and then some of the maintenance needs of projects. This slide is showing a sample seed mix. This is a mix that gets used typically over thousands of acres in Minnesota each year, mainly through mitigation projects, because we do a lot of wet meadow restoration as part of mitigation. And so this mix has been adapted over time. It's not a terribly diverse mix. We are in the process of updating this mix. We have some new information from different research efforts in wetlands looking at the success of this mix, which is helping to guide some of the decision-making with the mix. We think it's maybe a little too early successional focused, and maybe it needs more sedges and other species to shift that late successional stage. We also have additional information now about pollinators and use within wet meadows, which wet meadows are really high value for many pollinator species. There's one bee species in particular that's a specialist on Lismachia. So we're trying to find ways to incorporate native loosestrifes into this seed mix to benefit that species. So those are some of the considerations that we're thinking about with these types of mixes. This is a prairie mix that has been in wide scale use within Minnesota for mitigation primarily, but roadsides and other uses. Many of these prairie mixes that had been developed back in 2008, 2009, were trying to meet multiple purposes for roadsides and mitigation. So we're making a shift where we will have specific mitigation focused mixes that'll likely have lower grass percentages, higher diversity levels. You can see that this mix doesn't have any native sedges in it. So there's different components that we're working on adding into mixes like this. We have additional information about key plant species for pollinators, like ironweed is a good example. Ian Lane, through his research at the Bee Lab, was identifying that as a really important species. So there's certain species that we feel like we need to increase in these mixes to really maximize the benefits for pollinators and other species. Next, I want to talk a little bit about some of the trends in seed mix design. We've been emphasizing cover crops less within seed mixes, partly because we've been seeing them compete in some cases with some of the native species. And so that's generally been a trend. There are situations where there's steeper slopes where cover crops still play an important role. But overall, we've been trying to decrease the emphasis within mixes. It's been more common that we've been using temporary cover crops such as oats prior to seeding. Sometimes that's being done to allow time for chemicals to break down in agricultural fields prior to seeding permanent seed mixes. So that's been a key trend. Overall, increasing diversity levels within mixes, including insect host plants, focusing on climate resilience and overall resiliency of mixes, including culturally important species, and then matching mixes with working lands goals such as grazing and haying. So with our current seed mixes, we have around 33 standard mixes. Those are the ones that have numbers associated with them that are in MnDOT's spec book and on our websites. We have around 40 pilot mixes that have been developed. These are the experimental mixes. And I think it's important to note too that these mixes are provided by private seed vendors. So private seed vendors are important conservation partners in this whole effort. They're the ones that are providing the seed based on these native seed mixes. With the current mixes, we have different ranges for planting. For the grassland mixes, we have 3 primary ranges, though we do have some grassland mixes that we're thinking about for northeast Minnesota for roadsides and other uses. Woodland mixes cover the entire state, covering different biomes of Minnesota, and then wetland mixes for southwest and then northeast Minnesota. And these are based on the Minnesota ecoregion map that DNR developed. The 33 primary state seed mixes have a numbering system. For the first digit is for native or non-native. The second digit is function. Third digit is planting area. Fourth is hydrology. And then the 5th digit is version. So on these different mixes, you'll see these numbers, like 33-261 is referring to that numbering system. And this slide is showing the different stormwater seed mixes. The state seed mixes can be found on Bowser's website. We have a seed mix page. If you do a search for Bowser seed mixes, you can get to this page. When you first visit the site, there will be a list of all of the mixes that come up down below. And there's about 4 or 5 pages of them that you can scroll through. And there is a search screen as well, where you can put in your parameters for your site conditions or your site location to come up with a shorter list of mixes. I mentioned those pilot mixes. This is some examples of some of those types of pilot mixes that we've been developing for more specialized types of projects. So for solar projects, landfills, wetlands with high invasive species pressure, conservation grazing, sand mines, eroding banks, impoundments, trail edges, pollinator plots, floodplains, buffers, biofuels. So in some cases, we're creating these mixes to create a model of what we would like to see used in the state if there's further trends with certain types of projects. And biofuels is a good example. We haven't seen that take off within the state, but our preference would be to see native species being used if possible. And that was part of the intent of developing a pilot mix for that use. There's different mixes being considered as pilots, pollinator landfill cap. There's been a need for a mix under solar panels where there's more shade. For tree and shrub establishment, having a ground cover mix, tree and shrub transitioning from grassland to shade, which would have more shade tolerant species in it. We've also been talking about the need for a tree and shrub seed mix. There will be a real increase in the planting of trees and shrubs within Minnesota, primarily focused on climate mitigation in future years. And it would be useful to have different tree and shrub mixes available in addition to planting more mature trees and shrubs. Hayable native buffer mixes, stormwater mix with aggressive native species. We've been working on some lawns to legumes, native meadow mixes, the kind of verge on lawn mixes or native meadow mixes, and then invasive competition mixes. There was a substitution table developed for state mixes back in 2009. In most cases, substitutions are our first recommendation when certain species aren't available. And that's where this list has been helpful. This document focuses on plants that have a similar ecological niche and a similar cost was the intent when we developed this. It hasn't been updated since 2009. So this is something we'd like our stakeholder group to be thinking about, how we update this list and also how it fits with MnDOT substitution system, because they have a substitution system as well. As part of the update of mixes, we are adding lists of additional species that could be added into an individual mix. So these will be attached to a mix as we move ahead. I think long-term, we'd like to have some type of interactive computer screen where you can enter changes within state seed mixes easily and just adapt the state seed mixes. We really see them as beginning points for project planning for restoration. So we encourage changes within the seed mixes, and we'd like to make that as easy as possible in the future. We're also working on some fact sheets for the mixes. The fact sheets will provide additional information about the mix, about similar state seed mixes, suitable conditions, how to modify the mix for site conditions and goals, some of the site preparation, seeding and management needs, some of the expectations of what these mixes will look like, so including some pictures of years 1, 2, 3, and maybe beyond, and then some of the problem solving that could be considered for these individual mixes. So with our current work with the state seed mixes, I mentioned the stakeholder group. We have about 100 people involved in this effort who are helping to review the mixes. So these include people from federal, state, and local agencies, tribal nations, seed vendors, consultants, a really wide range of different stakeholders that are involved and looking over mixes as we make updates to them. They're also involved in looking at some of the resources like the fact sheets and the substitution tables. And we welcome more involvement with this group as well. So if anybody who's listening to this presentation is interested in being part of the stakeholder group, definitely feel free to contact me and we can add you to the group. It's just very beneficial to have a lot of different opinions and perspectives when it comes to these mixes, make sure we're meeting needs in different parts of the state. With the current mixes, we've been having more thorough review by some agencies. Megan Bennett from DNR has been looking at the prairie mixes recently. Karen Jokala from Xerxes Society has been looking through most of these mixes from the perspective of pollinator benefits, really going through them thoroughly before we send them out for review by stakeholders. So that review has been very helpful. We have sent out the pollinator and wetland mix drafts for the updates of mixes. And these will be followed by the prairie buffer and woodland mixes, and then other mixes as we have them available. We have a pretty small group within our agency that's working on the update of these mixes. We have multiple programs that we're running and coordinating. So we're trying to fit in this effort whenever we can. So we don't necessarily have a set timeline for this. We're just trying to keep our momentum going, trying to continue sending out different batches of mixes when we have them ready for the stakeholder group. And then we've been updating the new seed mix fact sheets and the substitution tables. And so that'll be ongoing as well. And then some of the resources that we've been working on along with the state seed mixes, we have our native vegetation establishment and enhancement guidelines that act as essentially a standard for the use of vegetation on Bowser funded projects and LCCMR funded projects, the Minnesota Wetland Restoration Guide. We have some resources specifically for the lawns and legumes program, like planting for pollinators, landowners guide to conservation easements, a few different toolboxes, a climate resiliency toolbox, a buffer toolbox, and then a pollinator and biodiversity toolbox, and also our What's Working webpage. This is a peer-to-peer resource where practitioners have been adding information to this by sending us essentially paragraphs or longer of information about what's been successful for their projects. We've been adding information into that website since about 2009. So if anybody out there has information that you'd be interested in sharing about projects that you're working on, we'd be very interested in receiving that information. Okay, thank you. I can turn it over to Jessi now.
Thanks, Dan. And Jessi.
Okay, I need the host to let me in. I'm back on my video, please.
I think, Jessi, you can
Oh,
just.
there we go. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. All right, let me share my screen here. Okay, so
Looks good, great.
good, thank you. So hi, everyone. Dan, thanks for the great presentation and the strong overview of Bowser and all of the moving parts to your operation. So it's really neat to see how the private and public industries fit together in this work that we do. So my name is Jessi Strinmoen. I'm with Shooting Star Native Seeds. We are a commercial seed producer. We grow, harvest, clean, and sell native grasses, wildflowers, sedges, and rushes, sell as individual species and sell as mixes. So we have about 2,500 acres in production. So we grow and harvest about 100 different species, but we work with probably closer to 300. So we buy and sell with other seed companies. We work with contract growers. We work with collectors to make sure we're able to offer all of the seed that is needed for a seed mix. So I just wanted to take a little bit, just a couple minutes to tell you a little bit about our operation so that you can see how the industry kind of fits into this picture. But I will do my best to speak on behalf of the industry. We're a pretty small industry and we work pretty closely together. So none of us grow and harvest all of the seeds that we need to do any one mix. So we buy and sell among each other just as much as we sell to our end users. So I'll do my best again to speak on behalf of the industry, but we are just, of course, one piece of the puzzle. So just about Shooting Star, we have been around about 25, actually 30, a little over 30 years now. We are located in Spring Grove, Minnesota, which is about an hour south of Rochester in the far southeast corner of Minnesota, just north of the Iowa border and not far from the Mississippi River. We have about 2,500 acres in production, split between 3 regions. And then we have probably about 25 employees that cover our production, our maintenance, our warehouse needs, our office and sales, and all of that. So we are, our organization is largely wholesale. So we kind of like to say we measure in acres, not in square feet. Our customers include other seed companies, restoration organizations, government organizations, DNR, DOT, contractors, installers, people who are, maybe doing seeding for, 5 to 10,000 acres a season on behalf of landowners or other contracted projects. So that's a little bit about us. Just a couple of pictures of our facilities here. The red building is our cleaning facility. So all of our seed is harvested and then goes through many different cleaning processes to get down to the seed that we sell as either a mix or individual species. Those seed cleaning processes include things like sorting by weight, by size, by gravity, using airflow to separate seeds, all sorts of steps to get down to the bare seed that we sell. Our warehouse facility is climate controlled and temperature controlled for the best longevity of the seed. So that's really important for seed storage and germination rates. And, some of our mixes leave in 1 pound packages and some of our mixes leave on several semis loaded full of pallets. So we do everything in between. So, Bowser mixes or CRP mixes or individual mixes, DOT orders, it all comes down to high quality seed. And that's something that we pride ourselves on as a seed company. It's something that we've really worked hard to maintain in our reputation. So high quality seed obviously is a huge crucial component to every seed mix, right? If you don't have good seed to start with, it doesn't matter how well you prepare the soil. It doesn't matter what type of seed you put on the ground, that just simply won't have a successful project without good seed to start with. So what does that mean? Good high quality seed means different things to different people. So there's different elements that fit into that. And I know you are all kind of very familiar with some of this, so I'll just breeze through it. But local ecotype is very important. We focus on primarily the Midwest. In our warehouse, for example, with Big Blue Stem, we might have 30 different lots of seed coming with different origins on them. So some Minnesota, some Wisconsin, some Iowa, Illinois, different areas so that we can match the best seed to the project needs. Local is a little bit subjective. You know, some people will say local means I need seed within 50 miles of the project location, which isn't always very doable. Local for many people means within 200 miles of the project location. Local may also mean within Minnesota or the surrounding states. So a little bit subjective when we hear those words, but seed does better when it is grown in the same ecosystem of where it originally came from, of course. So making sure we understand pure live seed. We sell everything as pure live seed unless it's requested otherwise. Pure live seed, and just in a nutshell, means that it takes into account all of the testing information for purity, germination, inert matter, et cetera, et cetera. And when we sell you a pound of seed, you may actually receive a little bit more to accommodate those testing factors. So pure live seed is really important, paying attention to the inert matter and the testing details that come through, making sure seed is properly stored. And then, of course, as you probably all know, Minnesota has a seed law that requires tags with every seed, either mix or individual species that leaves our facility. So that documents the lot number, the species name, the origin, the variety, the purity, germination, inert matter, and the hard seed percentages. So that's the very quick high level look at high quality seed, but that is really important to Shooting Star. I think as an industry as a whole is very committed to making sure that the seed we get onto the ground is as high of quality as possible. So back to Bowser. Bowser is a really instrumental in these state mixes are really instrumental into all that we do. So we sell Bowser mixes to different state agencies, like Dan mentioned earlier, the DNR, DOT has their own set of rules essentially, but very similar kind of sister mixes. A lot of our Bowser mixes go to installers and contractors. We see pipeline and roadside and utility right-of-ways and wetland mitigations, tribal land, solar projects, and then some just directly to landowners. The benefit that we see to Bowser mixes is that it is one solid step to making sure that the appropriate seed is used for the site conditions that somebody has. So it makes it easy for people who may not know and understand native seed, or maybe don't want to know all there is to know about native seed, to figure out what they need on their site. You know, that actually is really common, where we get a contractor who's looking at some specs, or looking at, you know, he has the site conditions but doesn't know what he needs to plant. That's really common for us to be able to say, you know, to either make a recommendation for a specific Bowser mix, or also to see those Bowser mixes spec'd in those projects, which is a great way to ensure that even people who don't know or care about seed are getting the right seed on the ground. It gives buyers a starting place for mix design. Mix design is really complicated. Obviously, all of the ecological factors that Dan talked about going into a mix factored with pricing, factored with availability. I mean, all of those things have to work together. So Bowser is really instrumental in making sure that our customers have at least a starting place. And then for the bidding process, which you know, looks very different from depending on who's issuing a bid or who's bidding on a project. Standardized mixes like this give some of these projects some consistency when we are bidding on a seed mix, or another company is bidding on a seed mix. You know, then at least we're able to get closer to you know, comparing apples to apples. So, Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing about Bowser seed mixes for us as an industry is that we rely on state agencies and the research facilities behind all of these seed mixes that come out of Dan's group and the state agencies behind them for the research and the long-term testing and the tweaking and the evaluations and the input from those stakeholder groups. And as a company, we don't have that capacity or those connections across the state and across the region. And so it is a tremendous resource to be able to kind of piggyback off of that work and making sure that we can marry that important work with the producing side of things. All right, just a couple of things that fits into just how the industry fits into this picture. I think it's important to know what it takes for us to get a seed mix out the door. And, you know, one thing I briefly touched on this before, but is to know that the seed industry works together really well. And we buy and sell among each other as much as we buy or as much as we sell to a customer, like I mentioned. So that allows us to have a wider offering of seed with different origins from different parts of the state. It allows us to have species that we maybe don't specialize and grow. But it really helps for us to be able to kind of expand our inventory on what we can put together to meet the requirements of any seed program. Supply and availability, of course, is always the unknown when it comes to standardized mixes. And unfortunately, seed is not like making widgets, right? We can't just make more. And that's a really common thing that we run into. So every year, there's some species that become short in the industry. And that typically has to do with weather conditions, with growing conditions. You know, this year we're going to see some challenges with some of the shorter grasses because of the drought conditions in Minnesota. This year, you know, rough blazing star and lupin are tight everywhere in the industry. You know, a few years ago, as the pollinator craze really started to ramp up, the industry wasn't quite ready for that. It takes years to respond to those sorts of things. So as we saw an increase for milkweeds and all of the pollinators, you know, that's where the availability and the supply really gets challenged. So I think it's important to remember that it does take years for industry to respond. So it's not as simple as go and plant a new field of lupin and then you'll have more, right? So natives take many years to grow and get to the point where they're producing viable seed. So it's not a lucrative industry to get into because of that reason. And so ramping up production isn't really a short-term solution in the industry. And so our options then become looking at subbing for species, so putting subs in for similar species or increasing the existing species in the mix. And typically when that happens, there's lots of back and forth between a contractor and a seed company about what's allowed, what's best. You know, we try to make the best recommendations based on what we know about the site conditions, based on what we know in the mix that they're bringing forward to us. You know, we're really careful to make subs based on seed count rather than always by weight, because if, you know, obviously if you have a seed that has very small seeds and a subbing for a seed that's typically very large seeded, that balance gets out of whack. So, and then with all of this, you know, obviously the price factor comes into play. So I would say Bowser mixes by and large are reasonably priced. They're very in line with everything else we see. Yes, there's cheaper ways to do natives. That's not better unless somebody needs that. And so that's kind of a careful balance that we walk. CRP is a great example, right? People are looking for cheap native mixes for CRP. They're not always the best mixes. We understand that, but our approach to kind of balancing that is that, you know, somebody putting in 100 acres of CRP, even if it's not the very best mix it can be, is still really beneficial to wildlife and water quality and all of those things. And so price obviously comes into play as we're evaluating mixes, but I think something to think through is that the seed mixes for us are priced based on the sum of the parts, right? So if you add in a few species that are $3,500 a pound or $2,500 a pound, that increases the per acre price really quickly. Likewise, if you look at some of the more common species, some of the more readily available species, easily commercially produced species, those those can help bring down some of those prices. And so it's a careful balance of having the perfect mix and the right number of diverse species in there, and the price that meets the customer's needs and the availability. So all of those things have to come into play. So again, our goal is to always help the customer get the best seed for their project, whether it be a Bowser mix or a modification from a Bowser mix, or if they have a CRP requirement or whatever their requirements are. The right mix means many different things to different people. As I mentioned, kind of origin, design, price, all of those factors come into play. So we're lucky in Minnesota. We work throughout the Midwest, everything from the Dakotas over through Ohio and Illinois, as far south as northern Missouri, all throughout Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa. We're really lucky in Minnesota to have our state agencies leading the way with these types of standardized mixes, but also the pilot mixes that are coming down the pipeline. They're always my go-to if I have a customer that calls and lays out a whole bunch of site conditions. It's really a great resource for me to be able to do that. So Minnesota's really led the way. We don't see that from all of the states we work in. We're super lucky to have that, especially as, there's new challenges coming up, right? We're seeing more and more solar, our pipeline projects look different. And so to see some of those pilot programs really leading the way is really beneficial. So thanks to Dan and the team for pushing that forward. And then, thank you all for having us today and having the conversation. And that's all I've got.
Great. Thank you, Jessi, and thank you, Dan, for really excellent presentations. We have a lot of good questions coming in, and a reminder to use that Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to add your question. So Jessi, I'll start with a question for you. It seems like a limitation of the current industry is that seed production is in part determined by demand, but also the demand is partly limited by what's produced and available. So this person asks, how do we break this loop to incorporate new species into the supply chain? Yeah.
So I think one really important thing to know is that, we all like to think that we just plant a new field, right? That's the easy way. We just plant a new field and we combine it or harvest it by a combine, and we throw it in the bins and it's ready to go, right? And, recognizing that, for example, like wetland species, are really tough to produce commercially. There's a lot of species that don't grow well as a monoculture. They just simply don't work in production. And so the industry is challenged to, responding isn't easy. So I don't know how you break the loop. I think for us, it's really staying on top of the trends. We know there's a lot of solar coming down the line. That's going to be really important for prairie on the ground, right? And being able to respond to some of those trends. We saw the pollinator craze really ramp up and take off. And so that changed the way that we plotted out what we were going to plant. We're always seeking new sources for seed, collectors or commercial growers, things like that. So being in constant communication and being able to predict those trends, I think is going to be really important.
Great, thanks. A question for you, Dan. Could you elaborate a bit more on the review process and how that works? For example, are these mixes tested in the field prior to release, or is the evaluation through the stakeholder review?
Yeah, that's a good question. So with the update of the current mixes, we have different agency and organization staff that are providing more of a detailed review of those mixes. And then we incorporate those edits, and then they're going out to the stakeholder group for additional input. Then we bring back those comments and are working those comments into those mixes that we've sent out. It's a little different for some of these pilot mixes that we have developed. We see those as more experimental, that we want different partners to be trying those mixes within landscapes and then providing input to us about them. Or if we have opportunities on our own projects that we're working on through mitigation or other purposes, we'll try those mixes. So that's more of a ongoing process, trying to understand exactly how well those mixes are doing. We're a little nervous to roll those out too widely if we don't know for sure how those mixes are going to work. But at some level, we need to do that too. We need to just make changes in mixes, have those mixes used, and then try to keep collecting information about how successful they are and keep making changes over time.
Thanks. This is a question for both of you, either or both of you can answer. And it's a question about sort of facilitated or assisted migration, where species from further south are being brought to the north with an idea to, with an eye towards climate change. I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
And I'll let Dan talk to the ecological side of that, but we are definitely seeing that question come from consumers in terms of them evaluating what's going to grow long-term into the future. So yeah, it's a thing.
And I think the ecological community is, it's something that's getting a lot of discussion. It's probably happening the most with trees and shrubs, where, there's a need recognized that, it takes longer for them to produce seed and to have generations and change genetics. With herbaceous plants, there's a lot of discussion happening about that. One thing I think would be useful is for us to be thinking more about what species are at risk with warming climate, that we should be moving those species, and there's some of that work happening. But I think with herbaceous plants, we're still trying to figure that out. We are thinking about that with some of our seed sourcing, that, if seed isn't available from different areas, that the first preference might be to go further south to find that seed. And the seed sourcing, Jessi, you mentioned that earlier, it's complex and, it's a little bit different for every organization. So something else we like our stakeholder group to be thinking more about as well.
Question for you, Dan. How do you take into account that some species might be more aggressive and outcompete other species that are in a mix?
That's definitely a consideration as we're thinking about species composition and the percentages of different species within mixes. As we design these mixes, we're starting off thinking about seeds per square foot. And so we're thinking about how many seeds of each species we want within 1 square foot, and then that's multiplied over a site. Really, a lot of that comes down to just field experience, seeing, project after project and seeing what's resulted over time. Like in the case of Big Blue Stem, it's something that we're actually scaling back a bit in some of our prairie restoration projects because it's become very dominant in some projects over time. We don't really have a good resource yet that highlights the most aggressive species or ones that aren't very aggressive, and we need to have a lot more seed within mixes. It's something I would like to work into some kind of publication at some point, because I don't think we have good information about that in Minnesota. It's reflected in some of the mixes, like, that wet meadow mix we saw, you'll see just lots and lots of seeds of like woolgrass and green bulrush, because they're tiny, tiny seeds and they just don't come in from seed. But it's relatively inexpensive by individual seed because they're so tiny. So, those are things that we just observe over time and we're trying to work into these mixes.
Jessi, a question for you. You mentioned that Minnesota has a seed tag law, and how has that affected the native seed industry? Has that been beneficial? Has that introduced challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Minnesota seed law requires that we include a long list of things on our seed labels, and reputable seed companies who are doing seed right that's easy to do, right? We are testing our species every 9 to 12 months as required. We're storing it correctly. We're documenting the origins. You know, we can, when a seed mix leaves the door, we have a paper trail behind every single species and its history and where it came from and how we got it and all of that. And so the seed companies that are doing this correctly, it's easy. I think where some seed companies have maybe skirted the law is with some, I mean, I would say criminal offenses, right? I mean, if they're mislabeling something, if they're intentionally altering something, then that's not okay. So it's lots of spreadsheets, though. I mean, we keep track of everything.
A follow-up question I have for that, you know, Palmer amaranth being found in Minnesota for the first time a few years ago, apparently from contaminated CRP seed mixes, has gotten a lot of attention. Has that had kind of a ripples through the industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Palmer amaranth, you know, just kind of came to light a couple of years ago as it started to hit Minnesota. And what we know is that Minnesota seed law, if, you know, companies are reputable and they're doing what they're supposed to do, there's measures in place that doesn't allow us to sell it. So if something happened with our production field where we had Palmer amaranth tested, it would first show up as a noxious weed. It would show up as an amaranth species. And then we have a process in place to send it out for a DNA test that would confirm whether it was indeed Palmer amaranth. And so there's a process in place, there's a policy in place. The seed companies that are doing it right, it couldn't leave our door because there's walls up in front of it. When it was introduced into Minnesota, as I understand, it was by some mislabeling and by some folks that maybe shouldn't have been in the business anyway.
Thanks. This is a question about, you know, sort of another system that seed mixes could be used for. Dan, do you have any thoughts about mixes geared towards food plots that hunters set up? You know, this person suggests that maybe that's another opportunity to get a little habitat restoration out of the hunting world rather than people just using these, you know, annual deer mixes that are non-native species.
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't thought about that too much. I know there's been some exploration of some native species that could be used in those types of plantings. You know, we have native sunflowers, you know, things like that maybe could be an option. Or maybe there's opportunities for mixing some of the, you know, corn and native species together in some way. So yeah, that's a good thought. I think that'd be a good thing to explore further.
And we do, just from an industry perspective, and we get that question a lot of how natives can be used for specific habitat, food sources and whatnot. And you know, our advice is typically to help landowners really think through what their property looks like in terms of, you know, their neighbor's food plot and the habitat they can provide for bedding and the source of food. I mean, how do all of these pieces fit together? And maybe it's okay that natives aren't the one-stop answer if they can be partnered with, you know, other things that are beneficial for deer or birds or whatever they're after.
Yeah. That's a great segue to another question about lawns to legumes and the use of native versus non-native species for those, if either of you would want to comment on that.
Yeah, that's one of the programs that I coordinate, and you know, we do have a lot of discussions about that topic, and probably the topic that comes up the most is white clover use within lawns and within mixes. And there's a lot of debate about that, you know, whether it can be aggressive in some landscapes and, you know, what is the value to different pollinators. So the majority of that program is focused on native species, with the exception of lawn mixes that do incorporate some non-native clovers in them, along with fescues quite often. But we have been developing these native meadow mixes for lawns. A group of us got together to try to come up with some mixes that we thought could work, that would be low enough, aesthetically pleasing enough for these residential landscapes, They haven't been tested yet either. So, that always makes me a little nervous when we're creating these new mixes. And that's where I'm debating, do we call these lawn mixes or meadow mixes? Because we want to set an expectation of what these will be, that these aren't going to be really short and really, neat looking. So, those are things we're working on and thinking about how we can expand some of the mixes and native species use for these programs.
Thanks. Jessi, a question for you. I think a lot of us were interested to hear about how much you work with other producers and how much kind of cooperation there is there. And yeah, if you could say talk a little bit more about the upsides, or are there downsides to that arrangement? And could you potentially end up getting stuck with it's a sort of like musical chairs where maybe sort of like get stuck with too much of something? Or...
Well, absolutely. So the industry, I always explain it as, it's kind of a funny thing, because our competitors are also our friends, right? And so because of that, we have to find a way to play nice in the sandbox, right? I mean, we rely on our other seed producers to get the products that we need to fulfill a mix, as do they for us. And we all kind of have our niche things. We specialize in more of the grass production. Yes, we will go head to head against another seed company in a bid. Sometimes we get it, sometimes they get it. Sometimes it's because of price. Sometimes it's because of the origins that we offer. Sometimes it's because of availability. But there's also a lot of times where, we know what we can get from other seed suppliers. And so we have to be able to work together. And ultimately, I think that really benefits the industry, because especially with something that's so origin specific, it allows us to get better seed on the ground. The industry is not very big. There's only a handful of us that do it at the scale that we do it throughout the country, much less specific to the Midwest. And so I think within the industry, I can probably tell you most of the folks that work there and their kids' names. We're part of the same associations. We have conversations about production. In the last couple of decades, we're just making a lot of this up, right? I mean, growing some of these species in production is not a thing that's been documented over decades and decades of experience. So when it comes to modifying equipment or finding the right mixer, or figuring out how to make this combine work for that species when it didn't work for that species last year, we have to rely on our friends, who are also kind of our enemies sometimes, but it's a great industry.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. I'll throw this one to Dan. Someone is wondering if the hayable buffer seed mix that's in development could potentially be flexible enough for use as a roadside mix. They've seen varying success of natives on roadsides, depending on the local authority and landowner mowing and maintenance level.
Yeah, I'd have to take a closer look at that mix again, but I think it probably would work for roadside conditions. That was a mix that was developed with species that could be hayed and then fed to cattle. So we had NRCS grazing specialists looking at that mix. That one actually is a pilot mix that's up on our website if anybody wants to look at that one. We are looking at that one again, seeing if there's some slight changes that we want to make to it, but I think it probably would work for a roadside condition.
Great. Well, thank you both for really excellent presentations and discussion. If we weren't able to get to your question, I think Jessi or Dan would probably be happy to have you reach out by email if you want to follow up with them. And thank you all of you for attending today. This is our last in the series for the fall. If you missed any, you can put the link into the chat earlier where you can watch previous webinars. But this has been our second series in this partnership between DNR and University of Minnesota Extension, and we're hoping to do it again in the future. And one of the things that will shape that is the feedback we get from those of you in the audience. So when this ends, a survey will pop up on your screen. So please take a couple minutes to fill that out. We really value that feedback. in knowing who our audience is and planning our future webinars. So thank you again, Jessi and Dan, and thank you everyone for attending today. That was great.